Hi, I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. It's good to be back, and we have a ton of content today, so I'm going to cut right to the chase. With us today is my friend Steve Buist, award-winning journalist with Hamilton Spectator. 10 years ago, or thereabouts, 2010, the Spec did a groundbreaking piece of work on the impacts of concentrated poverty, poverty by postal code in Hamilton neighborhoods that, among other things, found that there was a 22-year life expectancy between affluent and impoverished neighborhoods. And this week, if you're lucky enough to be a Spec subscriber, or even if you aren't and going to the website, you'll see that they have done a retrospective on what's happened since then. So I want to start by thanking Steve for being here, by acknowledging the Spec and the work that you and your team have done on this really important piece of work that will challenge all of us to think about what we're doing and the plight of many Hamiltonians. I want to take you back, though, to start. Tell me about the genesis of this thing in 2010, thereabouts. What prompted you to look at it, and how did this series come about?
Yeah, so we had this idea that we wanted to do some testing and some data analysis. So it kind of evolved into this project where we decided we would look at where people lived and their health. Mm-hmm. And, a step here, a step there, I ended up getting connected with a gentleman by the name of Neil Johnston. He has an appointment in the McMaster Department of Medicine. He's a guy who has a lot of expertise in health data and mapping health data. And so connected to Neil was a gentleman by the name of Pat DeLuca, who is a map-making and statistician extraordinaire at McMaster. And so the three of us came together and put together this project where we obtained health data for people who lived in Hamilton. And the important things that we got were things like the age of the person, the gender of the person. We got every hospital and emergency room visit for every Hamiltonian for a 2-year period. And the most important thing that we got was something that allowed us to turn that person into a dot on the map. We didn't know their names. We didn't need to know their names. But the most important thing was to be able to take all of these hundreds of thousands of emergency room visits and hospital visits and group them together into little pieces of geography. And so we use census tracts, which we'll use the term neighborhoods. It's easier to understand. Mm-hmm. And so there's about 135, or at the time, about 135 of these census tract neighborhoods in Hamilton. And so what we were able to do was take all of these things that were happening to people from a health standpoint, group them together into these little pieces of geography. And because that's the same geography that's used to look at social and economic factors, we could then look at health indicators and social indicators and economic indicators and see how they all came together. And I think what was most noteworthy about that project was it showed that there are these tremendously strong connections down to a micro level between poor health outcomes and poor social and economic outcomes.
And let's highlight a couple, because I think one of the things that was shocking to especially lay people back then. I'm sure that folks working in healthcare had a pretty good sense of this, and some people in academia, but I think we have this notion in Canada that we're an equitable place and that by and large most of us have the same chance to have reasonably similar outcomes irrespective of which neighborhood we live in. And we often associate severe localized disparity with places like the US or in developing countries. So tell us a few of the things that took everybody aback when you first published.
Yeah, well, I think that's the crux of this, which is we live in a country with what we call a universal healthcare system. And I think by extension we think that universal healthcare system is an equal healthcare system. Mm-hmm. And that if we have an equal healthcare system where if everyone has that green Ontario health card, yeah, we all have the same access to a hospital, we can all walk into the front door of an emergency room, there's no barriers to us. So we all sort of, I guess we think that, well, if we have this equal opportunity to access healthcare, we must have sort of equal health. Now, we know we don't have equal health, but mm-hmm, we put that down to the choices people make. Right. You know, this person eats too much, this person mm-hmm, smokes too much, this person drinks too much, this mm-hmm, person doesn't get enough exercise. But what this series showed clearly is that it goes way beyond that, and that the deck is stacked against people of low income, people who are poor, and the people who are the haves in our society are way healthier. And it goes beyond just the choices that people make.
And just a couple of high-level data points.
So
Life
in
expectancy,
the
low
original
birth weight,
Code Red,
babies.
in the original Code Red, we found, as you said, a 21-year difference in lifespans between the best neighborhood and the worst neighborhood. We had a neighborhood where the lifespan was about 65 and a half years, which is, essentially third world outcomes. We had, the most important thing was that, from the best performing neighborhoods to the poorest performing neighborhoods, we had variations of outcomes that were 13 times, 20 times, 30 times difference in the rates. I mean, a doubling of a rate or a tripling of a rate would be noteworthy, concerning. Instead, we were seeing these variations of up to like 30 times for something like psychiatric visits for an emergency. And that's a 30 times difference, not across a country, not across a province. It's across parts of one city in Canada. And I think these are the things that started to sort of hit people between the eyes and made them realize that we have some serious inequalities in Hamilton.
So before we fast forward to this week's 10-year retrospective, talk to me a little bit about the responses that you had from the community, from institutions, from citizens living in different neighborhoods at the time, and just reflect a little bit upon what's happened in the interim before we talk about present day.
So I think, first of all, there was a lot of shock. I think people were genuinely disturbed to find out. I mean, I think we all knew that there are some, pretty obvious economic differences across the city. You only have to walk around some of the neighborhoods in the lower inner city. Wentworth and Barton, for instance, is a much different place than the Meadowlands in Ancaster.
Yep.
I think we knew that instinctively. What we didn't know, I think, is that just how unhealthy some of our fellow citizens are in this city. So, there's a lot of shock. I think there was, I'm glad that there was a lot of action, that it prompted people to try to come up with some ideas and some solutions. I think it prompted people to do some introspection, people who are in a position of power who can maybe do something about this. I've always said that I've applauded the city of Hamilton for not burying its head in the sand and for confronting this head on and saying, this isn't good enough and we're going to do better by launching the Neighborhood Action Strategy Program directly targeted at some of these inner city neighborhoods. But we also faced some blowback. There were people who were not happy about the what was perceived as the stigmatization of certain,
or stereotyping of
stereotyping
neighborhoods.
of people, which I'm sensitive to, and I've always tried to hopefully attack this in a sensitive manner. My position has always been, not talking about it for 100 years.
Does not
didn't
serve
do anything.
people well. Yep.
So I think the first step in this is to at least address it head on. What's the thing? You have to name the beast before you can fight it, and I think this was the first step in that process.
Talk to me a little bit about the specs, the experience in a newsroom where you're devoting extraordinary amounts of time over a long period of time that obviously is costly. My expectation or guess as a reader is that it doesn't drive certainly ad revenue or necessarily subscription based. So why has the specs been so engaged, and how's the conversation gone internally about the enormous commitment of resources and attention to this issue? Because it's certainly not copied by major dailies that I've seen across the country.
Well, for a period of probably at least over a decade now, the Spectator has been committed to doing what it can to address some of the issues of poverty in Hamilton. We actually had a reporter back in the more than a decade ago who his beat was the poverty beat, which is tough. Poverty is a tough thing to write about because it's a topic that causes a lot of people to become uncomfortable. I know that a lot of people don't want to read about poverty for a lot of reasons, and it's not because they're bad people. It's because It's a difficult topic. It makes some people feel guilty. It makes people feel uncomfortable. It's a problem that seems so large that it is almost insurmountable, and so it's easy for people to just say, well, I personally can't do anything about this. I don't really want to read about this subject that makes me uncomfortable, and so it's easy to just flip the page and move on. Actually, I've said to people, if you go back and read the first Code Red project, the word poverty doesn't appear nearly as much as people think it did. I tried to focus more upon the disparities between the best performing neighborhoods and the worst performing neighborhoods. And I think by extension, people started to realize that that really was what this was about. It's about, you know, why are people having these poor outcomes? Well, frankly, it's because they're poor.
Yeah. We're almost at the break, but in the second half, I want to talk to you about what's happened in health outcomes 10 years later. But in addition to the work you did initially about health, you also spent some time on education and what was happening there. And what's clear, if you look at the full perspective, including the series on cancer outcomes, is that the deprivation affects every facet of the lives of people living in concentrated poverty. And it's almost overwhelming. So I would say to you that the fear I have as we talk about what's happened in 10 years, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, is that overwhelming sense that it is too big, that there's too much to spare, will encourage simply a blasé, well, there's nothing we can do about this anyway, let's move on and read the sports section.
Yeah.
To that, what do you say?
I can understand why people would be discouraged. I am.
Yeah.
I mean, we did not expect to see the results that we've seen this time. I get discouraged. To give up, though, would be, I guess, 180 degrees the wrong direction to be taking here. It requires a redoubling of effort, but I also realize that people are going to say, you've been banging me over the head with this for 10 years now, and nothing's changed. In fact, things have gotten worse. So I surrender. I give up. I'm moving on to some other issue and devote my energy there. And so I'm hoping that this re-engages people, if that's possible.
I hope so. And on that note, we're going to go to a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the findings 10 years thereafter on Code Red. I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. My guest is Steve Buist, award-winning investigative reporter with Hamilton Spectator. We'll be right back.
If you are ready to play, we are ready to pay. Kiwanis TV Bingo is coming your way. Pick up those $3 bingo cards at any one of almost 200 vendors around the Hamilton community. Tune into Cable 14 on Monday nights at 7 p.m. and win cash. Over $150,000 up for grabs this season. You won't want to miss it. Break a dabber.
It's a rape whistle.
The Canadian Women's Foundation, moving women and girls out of abuse and poverty and into confidence.
Hi, we're back. I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs, and I'm with Steve Buist of the Hamilton Spectator talking about the 10-year Code Red retrospective. So let's get right at it. What did you find 10 years thereafter? And let me preface it by saying, obviously, there was some optimism that with all of the combined efforts of anchor institutions and community groups and neighborhoods and, frankly, our community foundation's commitment, that we would have seen some bright shoots and some signs of improvement.
Yeah, and we thought we were going to see that when we got the data, and we were devastated to discover that of the 13 health indicators that we had looked at originally, when we looked at them again, essentially 10 of them had worsened. Yep. And so only 3 had improved, and one of the 3 improvements was just marginal. So to find out that 10 of these things had gotten worse, we saw that the difference in lifespans went from 21-year difference to 23-year difference. The lowest lifespan actually dropped and is now below 65 years, which, as I've said to people, is, we're entering AIDS-ravaged countries in Africa territory for a lifespan, and that should be shocking to people. Across a wide swath of the lower inner city, from, if you can picture, from James Street to Kenilworth, in that decade, the average lifespan actually declined by a year and a half. And that's not a statistical anomaly based on just a couple of deaths. I mean, there were over 1,200 deaths that came together to make that average. So,
can I interrupt and ask for clarification? One of the assumptions that I've heard from some people is, well, the opioid crisis was the thing contributing to that. And given the longitudinal nature of the data we're dealing with, that doesn't appear to be the case.
Oh, it's I think the opioid crisis certainly plays a role in that
number. Okay.
In that part of the city, there were probably an extra 100 deaths a year due to the opioid crisis, and so
and frighteningly still climbing, apparently.
Yeah. And so, those are generally going to be younger people, and so when you stop a life at age 25, it's going to start to do some damage to your overall average.
Yeah.
So we saw that. We saw that emergency room visits are just climbing rapidly, just generally throughout the entire city, which is worrisome because all areas of the city showed an increase.
Mental health stuff is just off the dial.
It certainly seems to be a crisis. The proportion of ER visits for psychiatric reasons is skyrocketing. And again, worrisome is the fact that it's happening everywhere in the city. Suburbs, the mountain, the lower city, everywhere.
Availability and enrollment with family docs had improved, and yet outcomes for the people that were in fact enrolled didn't seem to change. Can you just speculate on what we know about that? Because obviously that was a major concern 9 or 10 years ago that we seem to have made some headway on, and yet confoundingly results have not changed, and in some cases they're not any better.
Yeah, I mean, there were huge declines in the number of people who don't have a family doctor, and throughout the city it was cut in half, and it was cut in half like in some of the areas where it was 12 or 13%, down to 5 or 6%, which is great. And that was the result of some very aggressive recruiting by the family health teams in Hamilton. I think the McMaster one had registered something like 5,000 new patients in the last 4 or 5 years. But the paradox is that you have all of these people that now seem to be attached to a family physician, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything to keep people out of hospitals and emergency rooms. And so that could be a factor of an aging population. I'm not blaming the elderly, but it's a fact that the older that you are, the more you access healthcare services. And we're now at a point where slightly more than 1 in 6 people in Hamilton is 65 or older. So it could be a factor of an aging population. It could also be that people have a family doctor, but are still choosing for whatever reasons to go to the ER or go to a walk-in clinic because maybe that's where they feel most comfortable. There's still a lot of hurdles to get over to get people the right care at the right time in the right place.
Before we turn to some of the brighter spots in the 10-year Code Red retrospective, the other feature that jumped out was the piece on Vanier Towers, 3 city housing-owned high-rise buildings in the downtown core that my recollection is had a life expectancy of about 57 years. And I know the medical officer of health, Elizabeth Richardson, Dr. Richardson, talked extensively about some of the efforts that are going on there to engage tenants and deal with the very real issues there. But how did you receive that piece of
so
data?
the city's public health department had just completed a health profile study of the residents, and I commend them again for that, for going into the building and getting people to sit down and tell them the stories. And you know, I mean, you're dealing with people who clearly have a lot of issues. You know, the vast majority of the people are on some sort of social assistance.
Many
a lot
have
of them
been living precariously around the street previously.
80. I think the number was 80% of the people in Vanier Towers prior to arriving there were either homeless or living in some sort of precarious situation. Huge levels of mental health issues. Not surprising given the stress that people would be under. And there's, you know, a lot of emerging scientific research that suggests that, you know, it's the stress and the stress of poverty that might be what's creating mental health issues, not the other way around. We traditionally think, well, you start with a mental health illness.
And you become poor.
And you become poor.
Yeah.
Could be the other way around.
Yeah.
And so, you know, so I commend the city for going in there and starting to at least gather some data. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to start, we're going to have to start taking some of these targeted approaches and start with places like these, you know, easily identifiable buildings where you can say, okay, it's easy to look at this and figure out maybe some solutions. Maybe it's, as they've done, putting a physician in there, you know, once or twice a week, a nurse practitioner in there, some social work help.
Strikes me also thinking about the structure of public or affordable housing and how we integrate communities. Because certainly some of the evidence from the U.S. is that large high-rise towers filled with people with high needs and low incomes tend to create a bit of a combustible and negative situation for everybody involved. And so I think that too should inform some of our future funding and planning discussions. Unfortunately, we're down to about 5 minutes, and I don't want to spend all of the time on the depressing and negative parts, although they are substantial, and obviously we as a community are going to wrestle with them. A couple of the positive outcomes that strike me, let's talk about low birth weight babies, because that was a signal negative finding the first time around, and that was one of the areas that we've seen substantial improvement.
Yeah, so again, huge cuts all the way across the city. And particularly notable were the reductions in low birth weight rates in the lower inner city. To the point now where Hamilton's low birth weight rate is now below the national average, which you know, really is a bright spot. And I guess what that shows is in the wake of the original Code Red series, where we showed, I think there was a neighborhood that had something like 47% of the births were low birth weight babies. There were some really targeted, intensive programs put in place to attack that issue. And now, granted, it's a bit of an easier population to work with.
Can narrow the focus.
Yeah, because first of all, you know who your target is. It's pregnant women. And you only have to intervene for 9 months. It's not a lifetime of intervention.
And it tended to be a higher risk, mostly single mom population in a few of the neighborhoods, and they were
and
really
and a lot of teen moms, and the rate of teen moms has been dropping dramatically, not just in Hamilton but across Ontario. So I guess the good news takeaway from that particular indicator is that if you do make some really targeted, intensive efforts, it appears to work. So I guess the next question is, how do you then expand that?
Let me signal something else on that one, because we as a foundation got involved and actually were able to get a federal contribution together with an enhanced commitment from the city public health office to expand the nurse family partnership, which had proven results with high-risk teen moms. And that participation by a senior level of government has largely been absent on a bunch of these issues. And it strikes me that whether it's affordable housing or basic income or a whole bunch of other things, if we in fact going forward are going to find the resolve and the resources to deal with these really complex, really entrenched issues, it's going to take all hands on deck. And I think that is a positive signal that in arguably a smaller niche population, you can make a difference when all of the resources come to the party and focus on how you can make a difference. In the 2 minutes left, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the difference this time, 10 years thereafter, in terms of the participation, contribution, and willingness to listen, learn, and contribute to the process by the anchor institutions. Because I know that You've done the road tour with hospital boards and LIN boards and community groups and our board at the foundation. That strikes me as a different willingness to confront what we're struggling with here.
Yeah, so I think, when we did this in 2010, there was a lot of uncertainty in the community, and a lot of people weren't sure what it is that we were going to present, and we were, what we were doing was a bit of an unknown entity, and so I think what happened was that, people saw that we presented some pretty solid data with some pretty shocking findings. We've gone back and done it with different themes, so moms and babies, in 2011. We did the Cancer Project in 2013. And so, I think we have a little bit of a track record behind us. And so I think people now know that they can count on us to provide some good solid data, hopefully presented in a way that's compelling but not overly directed. And so the difference, I think, this time is that people are a little more willing to jump on board right from the start, because we're a known entity. Code Red's a known entity. It's known throughout the city. And I think people are now prepared to say, okay, we're going to accept this and let's figure out some solutions here.
Terrific. And sadly, on that note, we are out of time. But Steve, thank you for your contribution here today, but more importantly, thanks to you and the Spec for what I think is another groundbreaking series. If you have not seen the Code Red 10-year update, please go to the website or buy a Hamilton Spectator. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I know this conversation will be continuing, but it's the kind of journalism that makes a difference to communities. I'm Terry Cooke. I have been visiting with Steve Buist of the Hamilton Spec. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. We'll see you again next month.